I'm joined now by United States Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas. Good morning, Senator. Welcome back.
Good morning, Hugh. It's good to be back on with you.
I had Congressman Waltz on earlier. I know you're worried about the people in Milton's path. Can you explain for me whether or not FEMA has money? Because Secretary Mayorkas said they're out of money, but I thought you just passed a CR.
Yeah, so Hugh, I think FEMA has enough money for now to engage in the vital rescue operations that are unfortunately still going on in the Appalachian Mountains in Western North Carolina and Eastern Tennessee and Northern Georgia. Obviously, when it gets to recovery operations, that's probably going to require some more money. But at the moment, I think they have enough money to probably take us through the election when Congress is back in session. Obviously, Congress will monitor that, and if we need to provide more funds to FEMA before we come back after the election in November, then we can do that. I will note, Hugh, that this administration didn't come to us when we passed that stopgap resolution last month and say, we really need to move a little bit of money from this pot to that pot or the other pot, which is something that happens all the time, Hugh. And I'd also just observe that when this administration wants to spend money on its priorities, on building that dumb pier off of the coast of Gaza, we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars to pay off student loans for graduate programs in gender studies. It doesn't seem to have any trouble finding money.
Now, Senator, you've led me to Vice President Harris on The View yesterday. I want to play for people who have been underground or without communication what she said yesterday on The View when Sonny Hostin asked her a very simple question, cut number 2.
Well, if anything, would you have done something differently than President Biden during the past 4 years?
There is not a thing that comes to mind in terms of, and I've been a part of most of the decisions that have had impact.
Senator Cotton, how do you react to that? Not a thing would she do differently?
Well, it's an astonishing and revealing answer, Hugh, that Kamala Harris is simply more of the Biden administration, probably worse, given that she's more left-wing, more radical, and even less competent, as hard as that is to believe, dealing with Joe Biden. So if you want to return to the good times of the Trump era with prosperity, safety, security, then vote for Donald Trump. If you want 4 more years of what we've received from Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, vote for her. But I can give her some advice. I know she flubbed the question on some late-night TV show as well last night. She should just listen to what my kids or your grandkids sometimes say. It's opposite day. And just apply that to the administration. Opposite administration. Whatever Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have done for the last nearly 4 years, in retrospect, they should have probably done the exact opposite thing, and we'd all be better off.
Former President Trump told me that on Monday. He said Joe Biden's the worst foreign policy president in history, and if we'd just done the opposite of everything he'd said. And he's right. He's echoing Secretary Gates. Let's run through a few. You mentioned the pier. She could have said the pier was not a good idea. We're not doing a pier again. I guess we're in for a second pier if she wins.
Well, you can see that because her rhetoric about Israel's existential war against Iranian-backed terrorists like Hamas and Hezbollah always pays lip service very briefly to Israel and its need to kill these bloodthirsty terrorists, but then immediately and extendedly focuses on the need to provide humanitarian aid into Gaza and Lebanon. That's not our responsibility. That's not Israel's responsibility. That's a responsibility of Hamas or Hezbollah or Iran for using those civilian populations as human shields and firing points. But again, it's just another example of how she puts more pressure on Israel than she does on Iran or its terror proxies, even as she's admitting, Hugh, that Iran is our greatest enemy. Now, I would disagree with that. Iran is a mortal, implacable foe, of course, but China is clearly a more dangerous enemy than Iran. But second, even if she thinks Iran is our greatest enemy, why has she given them over $100 billion of economic relief and sanctions waiver? Why did they lift the embargo on their missile program, the missiles that were shot into Israel just last week? So again, these interviews are revealing Kamala Harris to be the San Francisco liberal she always has been.
When she says I can't think of anything, and she also says I was the last person in the room, often I go back to Afghanistan. Joe Biden originally set the date for 9/11. He realized that was bad. He moved it not backwards, but forwards to 8/31. He left Bagram, he left the equipment, he left Americans, green card holders, citizens, green card holders, and SIV eligible Afghans who'd worked with it. She wouldn't change a thing, Senator Cotton. Isn't that somewhat stunning?
It is. It is remarkable. And Hugh, let me tell you this. Let me pull back the curtain a little bit. It is widely known in Washington that almost every advisor, civilian and military, to Joe Biden recommended against what he did in Afghanistan. It is widely expected that when Joe Biden leaves office, those people, especially the civilians who worked in his White House and his State Department, his Pentagon, are going to throw him under the bus and say the old man wouldn't listen to us. He was too stubborn. He had a chip on his shoulder because Barack Obama didn't do exactly what he had recommended in 2009. We tried to warn him against this. So that is the word on the street in Washington, D.C., among the Democratic foreign policy elite. Yet Kamala Harris alone is still vocally and enthusiastically standing by Joe Biden's disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, which ignited so much of the chaos and war we see around the world by telling people like Vladimir Putin or the Ayatollahs that they could walk all over and push around Joe Biden and Kamala Harris.
She also did not separate herself, but endorsed President Biden's 100% his Ukraine policy. That includes, of course, when he said a minor incursion wouldn't be so bad, but it includes delaying weapon shipments and putting restrictions on weapon shipments. So I guess more of the same there. Money after money after money, but restricted money so that they cannot win.
Yeah, that must be the case, Hugh. Again, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris tempted Vladimir Putin to do what he's always wanted to do, which is reassemble the old Russian Empire, the most important part of which for him is Ukraine. And then after they failed to deter that war, unlike Donald Trump, I have to add, they pussyfooted around for now nearly 3 years, not providing Ukraine what they needed to win. This is consistent, too, by the way, with what they've done in Israel as well. They will not allow our allies to win the wars in which they're engaged. They won't even speak words like victory or win. It's always de-escalate, smooth over tensions. It's hard for a country like Israel, Ukraine to de-escalate when they're being invaded by people that want to wipe them off the map.
On Israel, I could name a number of things she could have said. She could have said, I would not allow our UN ambassador to withhold the veto on the Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire without mentioning the hostages. Joe Biden did that. She's got no problem. The border, of course, 10 to 15 million people across the border, nothing different. China, she could have said, I'd shoot down the spy balloon earlier. She could have said, I'd stand with Jimmy Lai, or I would have brought up the Uyghurs. She can't think of one thing, Senator Cotton. It's remarkable.
Yeah, and again, remember, Hugh, how Kamala Harris got this nomination to where she was. She didn't earn it. She was gifted it at the last minute. Now, say what you will about Donald Trump or Barack Obama, George Bush, Bill Clinton. I understand they're not every American's cup of tea. Some Americans are very, very strongly opposed to them from both parties. But all those men earned their nomination. Even the losers in presidential elections, they still earned it. They went through their paces for 18 months of town halls and bus stops in Iowa and debates and interviews. Kamala Harris was gifted this nomination. And what you're seeing now is what happens when someone is gifted a nomination and they don't have the ability, they don't have the conviction to explain to America the direction they want to lead our country. It's not a surprise to anyone who knows Kamala Harris that she cannot handle interviews on, for goodness sakes, The View.
The View.
She didn't come,
Senator,
she
on
didn't
this
come on your show.
on this
she didn't
respect,
come on Breitbart Radio. It's The View.
It's astonishing to me that she can't answer a question on The View. But I want to ask you this. I have been criticized by a washed-up political consultant for saying sometimes she strikes me as she doesn't have a thought in her head. That was the case yesterday. She could not think of one thing. She didn't have a thought in her head. Is this Kamala Harris? Does she have a terrible Biden team is it her sister Maya who blew up her presidential campaign? How is she this bad at campaigning?
Well, Hugh, let me just stress again, she was gifted this nomination. And at every stage, really, the Democratic establishment has plowed a path to her rise. Willie Brown did it in San Francisco when she ran for DA. The Obama team did it in 2010 when she ran for Attorney General. If you recall, Barack Obama campaign for her in the fall of 2010 for Attorney General, the race was so close. In California, it'd be like Donald Trump coming to Arkansas to campaign for an Attorney General. We'd love to have him, but it's a pretty red state. Probably not necessary. And then, of course, in 2015 and 2016, as you know, Hugh, the Democratic power structure in both Washington and California plowed her path to replace Barbara Boxer in the Senate. And they continued to, for her first 2 years in the Senate, to try to set her up to be the presidential nominee in 2020 until she totally bombed in 2019. She didn't even make it to the starting line in Iowa. So Hugh, I would just quote a line that you often like to quote in various contexts from Chariots of Fire. I can't put in what God left out.
You're right. It's one of my favorite quotes. I want to close by thanking you for your message when Emmanuel Clase gave up the 3-run dinger. I hope you'll be watching at 3 o'clock today when the Guardians beat the Tigers, Senator, in Detroit. Will you be doing that?
Well, it was a very tough loss for the Indians, but Clase doesn't give up many of those. I can't imagine he'll do it again. I think they need to beat the Tigers twice, though, because I would not want to face Tarek Skubal in the Game 5.
I do not want any more of him. Zero of him. Senator Cotton, always good to talk to you. Thank you, Senator. Be well. Follow him on X at Sen Tom Cotton, S-E-N, Tom Cotton.